Welcome to this session we're having on consultant clinical scientists in NHS Wales. This is part of ongoing communication, and this is a drop-in session. So we're hoping it's going to be very, very interactive. So we'll do some introductions from the team. So my name is Clive Morgan. I'm the Managing Director of the All Wales Medical Genomics Service. I'm also an Assistant Director at Cardiff and Vale UHB. That's Assistant Director of Therapies and Health Science. So I'm the chair of the Healthcare Science Network, and I'll be chairing this group today. So I'm going to pass it round to we've got some very senior healthcare scientists with us today. Not all clinical scientists, from sort of other professions as well. So if I can ask you to introduce yourselves, who will be hopefully responding to all the questions, and if we don't know the answers, we will get back to you. So I'm going to start with Sarah.
Hi all, so I'm Dr. Sarah Bant, and I am Associate Director for Workforce Transformation for Healthcare Science in HEIW.
Thanks, Sarah. I can see Adam.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Adam Partlow. I'm in my 4th year of training towards becoming a consultant clinical scientist in clinical bioinformatics, and I specialise in the physical sciences. I'm based in rehabilitation engineering in Cardiff.
Thanks, Adam. John Day.
Thanks, Clive. So my name's John Day. I'm a Clinical Director for Audiology at BCU Health Board, and I'm a consultant clinical scientist. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Colin.
Hi, I'm Colin Gibson. I'm a consultant clinical scientist specialising in clinical biomedical engineering, and I'm based within rehabilitation engineering in Cardiff and Vale.
Thanks, Colin. Helena Morgan.
Hi, I'm Helena Morgan. I'm Head of Neurophysiology at Swansea Bay University Hospital. I'm here in the capacity of Neurophysiology Profession Specific Group.
Okay, thank you. So, John Geen.
Well, my name's Professor John Geen. I'm a consultant clinical scientist. My specialty is clinical biochemistry, and I'm also the Assistant Director for Research and Development at Cwmtaf Morgannwg Health Board.
Thanks, John. This is Chris Morrell. Hi, Chris.
Hiya. Christine Morrell, Director of Therapies and Health Science in Swansea Bay.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so just a little bit of introduction to this session. You're probably all aware of the paper that was published not so long ago. I mean, it was a long time in the making. This is a really important piece of work that has been produced. Because it sort of sets out a framework for becoming a consultant clinical scientist. It also describes a standard approach to career development. And this is important for NHS Wales, but it's also been getting a lot of interest from sort of UK nationally and also internationally. I guess for me, it's really important in terms of raising the profile of consultant clinical scientists and healthcare scientists in general in NHS Wales. It certainly stimulated a lot of debate for our workforce and OD colleagues, and they're looking at ways now of creating sort of workforce development programs and how this consultant role can be integrated into multi-professional workforce planning. So these are conversations that we've never really had before. So again, this is a seminal and a very important document. So I guess for us, we'd like to hear what your thoughts are. You can have a lot of questions, and not all of them that we're going to be able to answer. So when we'll have a presentation from Sarah, we'll go through this, and then as we go through with, say, the experts we've got here, we'll open for questions. And hopefully we'll be able to provide some clarity on what it means in terms of the role, what it means in terms of, say, workforce planning in the future, and probably most importantly, what it means for you. So I'll hand over to Sarah now.
So just a quick presentation to get us started then on consultant clinical scientists in NHS Wales. So just talk you a little bit through the context in terms of the what consultant clinical scientists are, what the role means. It's a role that's been employed in healthcare science professions for over 40 years. This isn't something that's new. Consultant clinical scientists aren't present in every single corner of healthcare science currently, but for some, they've been absolutely fundamental for a great many decades. In around 2010, the UK Modernising Scientific Careers framework came into being, which gave us a structured training programme. So it brought together the various different training approaches across healthcare science areas into a single structured approach for the profession. It gave us a multiple entry points into the profession. We have entry points at assistant level, we have entry points at undergraduate level, but we also, slightly different to other professions, have an entry point at postgraduate level. But in addition, it also describes, exactly as we're talking about today, a training programme for consultant clinical scientists, and actually a higher register for those consultants to be registered onto as well. And the Academy for Royal Colleges, from the medical side, has given support for this training as being equally as tough as medical training, and indeed in pathology, consultant clinical scientists sit the same FRC path exams. So our healthcare science framework for NHS Wales was published by Welsh Government in 2018, and that's confirmed support from Welsh Government and the healthcare science profession around needing to strengthen the healthcare science pathway, but also promoting the understanding of the roles of consultant clinical scientists as senior leaders across NHS Wales. And also supporting the healthcare science network as the engine for enabling some of this transformational change. So the healthcare science network produced a document which was published this year, which describes the roles of consultant clinical scientists in NHS Wales and provides recommendations for implementation of this across Wales. It's an information and guidance document, sets out the roles, describes the routes to registration, gives a lot of information to help people to understand quite what we're talking about, the fact that it's not new, the fact that we have this structured training programme with it. We also have an equivalence route for those that don't wish to undertake a 5-year programme, but actually have been doing equivalent work, perhaps a PhD, perhaps leading on research, perhaps leading on service improvement throughout their career. And the document very much endorses the approach of adopting this across NHS Wales. So not piecemeal, not interested services, but actually for an NHS Wales wide approach. We have received endorsement from Welsh Government, from Directors of Therapies and Health Science, and from Health Education and Improvement Wales. And it was finally published in May of this year. So as I say, consultant clinical scientists have been employed for over 40 years, and in terms of the clinical side, provide valuable scientific clinical advice and care alongside medical consultants and other health and care professions. And the status is of the same level of professional competency as achieved by consultant medical staff, and that's justified by the training and the specialist expertise. So clinically, consultant clinical scientists are responsible for integrity of clinical scientific and technical knowledge base in their service. So both in terms of the actual clinical practice, but also in terms of the evidence base and what clinical practice is undertaken, and pushing forward the boundaries of that. They undertake in-depth, highly complex roles, requiring high level clinical judgments and advanced scientific expertise. But also there's a really important side in terms of strategic leadership and dealing with uncertainty in direct patient care. And that then brings us on to the second part of the consultant clinical scientist role, which is exactly that managerial and strategic leadership role. So in some areas, a consultant role may be focused around consultant level clinical practice and delivering some very complex care. In some areas, it may be about leading a service at a strategic level across a wide area or perhaps a multi-professional team. And in some areas, it's a mix of both. So across England and Wales, there's less than around 600 in the role. And that's across many different clinical specialties as we have in healthcare science. We believe we have around 30 in Wales, although there are challenges with the coding of this on ESR, because some people that are more of managerial role may be coded in terms of managerial coding. So there may be more than 30. As the clinical scientist role is a HCPC registered title, and its nationally recognised training and development route, we also then have that quality at the consultant clinical scientist role, So you're required to already be a HCPC registered clinical scientist, with then the additional registration onto the higher specialist scientific register. And there's two routes to that, either by the 5-year training programme, which is a professional doctorate training programme, or the higher scientist specialist equivalence process, which enables people to have their portfolio considered against a wide range of work that they've undertaken over a 5 or so year process, both in terms of their service delivery, but also, as I say, in terms of leadership, research delivery, and much more. And the ability then of consultant clinical scientists gives that fantastic mechanism to recruitment through to executive positions, such as the directors of therapies and health science. So, as Clive's already introduced, there's a number of people on the call today that have been both part of the creation of that document, but also part of a new implementation group in order to be able to deliver the changes across Wales and to support services to do so. And a number of the names that we have there today are, as I say, are part of that implementation group. So hopefully we'll have some fantastic questions, both around the roles that people are undertaking themselves, but also around how we can support others to do so. So I'll pass you back over to Clive now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah, for that. That's a comprehensive recap of the paper and sort of how we got there as well. So, in terms of questions, should we open it to the floor? So we'll take questions by a show of hands, or if you'd rather, you can type in the chat, and we'll pick the questions up from there. We've got one question that's come through.
What areas of governance or service standards have any of you been developed or been responsible for as a consultant clinical scientist?
So who would like to pick that up? John.
Thanks, Clive. Yeah, this is just up my street, really. Standards, and it's something that I've been involved in audiology for some years. Probably about 15 years ago, I was involved in developing service quality standards in audiology, and this took place at a national level, UK level at that time, led by Scotland, and I was representative from Wales for that work. And we developed, basically, in a nutshell, evidence-based service quality standards with input from service users, third sector organisations, to a defined government protocol developed by Quality Improvement Scotland at that time. And it's interesting, that started off then, and it's with us right now. And we've adopted those standards in Wales very well, but not just that, we've developed an audit process against them. And I've seen some real changes in service quality as a consequence across Wales. We've got measurable indication of service quality improvement. Now, I mentioned about them being evidence-based, and I think that's the key thing to me, is that when we developed them, we had academics around the table as well, and we linked each of the standards statements, linked to the hearing pathways, to evidence, the criteria to evidence which we score against. And that evidence, to me, is a distillation of the knowledge base around audiology, the research. And that's so important, because we're going to maybe hear later on people talking about the importance of us doing research. But when we do that, of course, it tends to be quite narrow, in quite a narrow field. And I think what service quality standards, why they're so important, is their way of pulling that together and translating that into what is good quality care for our patients. So I see it as really quite an efficient way of converting the knowledge base into good practice at a local level. And of course, doing it at a national level, it means that my contribution is more than just my own department, but it impacts across Wales and across Scotland. I've just been involved now doing similar work, advising Scotland on the same. So it's a real sort of a magnifier of our contribution, and I'd recommend it to anybody to get involved. Thank you.
Thanks for that, John. Matthew.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matthew Talboys, Head of Nuclear Medicine at Falindra. I also currently chair the Radiation Protection Specialist Standing Advisory Group to Welsh Government as well. So, well, firstly, thanks for putting on this session. I think it's really helpful, and I think Sarah and Colin, we've met before to discuss this paper as well. So I just wanted to bring up the point that I have raised previously, really, in terms of the recommendations. So in terms of one of the recommendations, recommendation 4 is about appointing to these consultant clinical scientist posts, and there's a deadline by the end of the year, and individuals need to be on the higher specialist scientific register. I think there's probably a general agreement here that there aren't many individuals who are currently on that register, and so that timescale looks fairly ambitious. And appreciating the advisory nature of this paper, I guess one of the things really is kind of how would you consider we increase the number of people or encourage people to become part of HSSR or go through HSST, because I imagine it's going to take quite a while before we get sufficient numbers of people on that register to allow for, you know, applicants to go forward to these consultant clinical scientist posts. So that's really kind of any sort of planning really around that aspect of it. Because in the absence of that, I think it's very difficult then to appoint people to these consultant clinical scientist posts. So I'd be, you know, I'm not debating the recommendation. I think it's fine, but I just wanted to know what the process would be to encourage people to get onto the register.
Thanks, Matthew. So who'd like to pick this one up? Colin.
Thanks, Clive. I think it's a really good question, Matthew, because clearly whatever deadline that we would set or would be set, this question would arise. So I can't really speak for HSST, although I am involved in it quite extensively. But I'll probably leave that to Sarah and to others to talk about how we can encourage taking HSST forward. But when it comes to the higher specialist scientific register and the equivalence route, I think there are many things that we could do to facilitate this. And I suppose for those who are not in the know, just to explain a little bit about equivalence and the process of equivalence, it's run by the Academy for Healthcare Science. And the idea is to make it as straightforward as possible. So there is an initial application process where people will put together what is called, what the Academy have called an extended CV. So people have a chance to outline what they've done throughout their career and where they are currently. And from that, if it covers the standards of proficiency, then sufficiently, then it will be a very straightforward process to achieve registration. Now, of course, not everybody who's going to be interested in this is going to be in that position. So that's where the real challenge comes. And I think what I've heard, and I know we've had this conversation, Matthew, and I've had it with others as well. What about those people who are not in an established consultant post, or even if it's not a consultant post, it's a position that's operating at that level, so they can draw upon all that experience and evidence. And it's relatively straightforward for them. And there are people I know who have been in that position and it has been quite straightforward. And if they're on the call, perhaps they might want to share their experiences. But for those who've had to put together a portfolio, it can be a bit more of a challenge, particularly if their role hasn't given them opportunities in order to develop their knowledge and skills to the sufficient level over the years. Well, there are things that we can do to support that, and I know that Health Education and Improvement Wales are already working very hard on doing that. And in fact, I'm aware of at least one individual, perhaps more than that, who's already receiving such support and is quite close to submitting his portfolio. So there are things we can do, and I'm sure whatever we do, there'll always be more we can do. But I'd like to think we're on the right track with this, and I'd be very interested on your thoughts, Sarah, if you'd like to add to that.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, I think we'll probably do a purpose focused session around training and equivalence, because I think it's something that we could really do with going into a bit of detail on, and certainly for any individuals that any of you are aware of that need a bit more understanding of the process and some encouragement, we could use that as a vehicle. But just in terms of quickly, the both the HSST and also the equivalence route are both fully funded by HEIW. So for the HSST, you can request numbers through your IMTP, and we're seeing a year-on-year increase of those numbers. Any individuals that you have in service that might be interested in that programme, we are keen to support individuals through that. As I say, both in terms of the funding, but also a question in terms of whether the bursary related to it may need to increase as well. And equally, anybody going through the equivalence route, both in terms of the fees, but also in terms of any additional courses or education, any modules, any particular learning those people may need to pick up. Again, we can fund those through the annual equivalence application process that comes out each April as well. So keen to support in terms of the funding, but also part of the implementation is trying to link people up together and to ensure that everybody's got appropriate mentoring. Would very much like to see a change to the previous system, where really only if an individual had been through the process locally before did you have the sort of the understanding inherent in your department to support others. But would very much like to see a lot more working across Wales and a lot more support across Wales, and keen to sort of lead from that, from the programme as well. So hopefully just within this year, both leading up to December into the coming year, we can start to enable some of that, but also set it up moving forwards as well and into the future. And just this week I've spoken with the current HSSTs that have their own network, and looking to pull them into some of those conversations as well, so that both in terms of when people are doing the programme, they've got access to some of the strategic changes that are happening and getting involved in those across Wales, so they get the real breadth of work that they can get stuck into, but also that we can draw the learning that they have to support others that are doing the equivalence route as well. And so everything links up together a lot more effectively. So we're certainly seeing a shift in interest. We're certainly seeing a shift in people looking to do this, both either approach, but keen to support that further, really.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for those great answers there. We've had a question from Daniel Hodds. So with the equivalence process, are you limited to the same training paths as the HSST training programme? For example, in neurophysiology, the HSST, you can choose either EEG or interoperative monitoring evoked potentials. Could you apply for equivalence having specialised in nerve conduction or EMG, for example, which is not part of the HSST programme? There's a tough question. Who fancies fielding that one?
I'll just give it a quick go, and then Colin can probably give a better answer.
Thanks, Helena.
I think, as we discussed before, neurophysiology is the embryonic part of this. We haven't developed a HSST candidate in Wales as yet, but we are going to meet with other people across the UK to find out what they did to get their HSST or their HSSE. But at the moment, and we've got a drop-in session in November with the clinical physiologies. So hopefully we'll be able to see how they do it and to see if there is a variation, and just to give us some background. But at the moment, as it's a blank canvas with us, we are just starting out. So regarding that question, yes, we can't answer it yet. I can't answer it yet, but we will be able to answer it in the near future.
Perfect. Thanks, Helena. Colin.
Thanks, Clive. I can't give an expert answer to this. Helena is very much more an expert in this field than me, but I can give a general overview around the equivalence process. Is that the idea of achieving equivalence? It's not meant to be narrow. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's meant to be broad. So the ways in which you might achieve the standards of proficiency are completely open to your own individual experience, and that includes what area of work you work in. When it comes to putting a label around it, I know so far as a register is concerned, they want to put labels on it. It helps to identify people's scope of practice, but it certainly doesn't intend to restrict it. So I don't anticipate that it would be a problem to specialize in a particular field that isn't obviously referenced at the moment.
Thanks, Colin. Mark.
Hi, thanks. Mark Botel, Rehab Engineering in Swansea. I'm currently a Principal Clinical Scientist. I just wanted to agree with Matthew's point around the timescale between the introduction and the implementation of Clause 4 seeming quite tight, and let's hope our current people in heads of departments stay in those positions, because otherwise we could be in a sticky place. But my point is more as a training officer for the last 10 years and just thinking about the people who come through and what they go on to do afterwards from the STP. I guess one little fear I have is that we'll have people wanting to go straight on to, or too many people, should I say, wanting to go straight on to the HSST, whereas maybe as a field discipline, whatever, we might want to encourage people to get some time under their belt as a clinical scientist and to do some good graft and get stuck in. Now I know they won't be completely pulled away from it to do the HSST, but I guess we're putting a lot of faith in that being something very valuable to them to do, potentially straight after they've done a 3-year training program. So I guess I just wondered whether there's some thought and maybe some wording around documentation or advice that we could be given to try and safeguard from every trainee finishing their 3 years and going straight on, I want to be a consultant clinical scientist, and how we support that best as centres.
Okay, thanks for that question, Mark. I'll chip in with this one, because for me, the HSST should be an enabler as part of a workforce planning program. So, you know, you should be thinking about creating the roles in service, because there is a danger, as you say, that everybody will put their hand up to do the HSST. They'll go through the program, and there won't be the jobs for them. So I think that's what we should be thinking about, really, the workforce planning element before we start putting people through on the training program. And there is going to be a balance then, you know, because you're going to have to manage expectations within the workforce as well, because we've got a lot of talented clinical scientists who'll be putting their hands up for these roles. But again, I think the key determinant will be the availability of jobs at the end of it. And then we've seen this previously, where we're getting trained consultant clinical scientists. There aren't the roles for them in Wales, and then they'll find jobs elsewhere, which is, you know, it's a double whammy. We've invested the time and effort into creating this resource, which we could certainly deploy in Wales, but if the job's not there for them, we will lose them. So I think that needs to be borne in mind as well. Colin.
I just wanted to add to what you said, Clive. I do think you're absolutely right about workforce planning. I think something, though, from a pragmatic point of view, in order to secure a commission, it already takes 18 months, sometimes up to 2 years. If you're then talking about 5 years training on top of that, you're trying to plan for 7 years ahead. That's a very, very challenging thing. So to a certain extent, I would suggest we may need to speculate to accumulate, but in a scientific way, if you know what I mean. So if we can plan our way forward, but keeping in mind that the world is going to be a very different place in 7 years' time, then yes, I agree very much that the workforce planning approach is the best approach.
And then that's what I said in the introduction. One of the key benefits for this is to start the discussion for the value of consultant clinical scientist roles with workforce and OD colleagues. And you know, now is the time to capitalize on that, because like you say, you know, it's going to take 5 to 7 years to get these scientists into senior roles, and they'll be filling gaps, and they'll be doing things that, you know, we can't imagine at the moment. So but finding that sweet spot between speculatively, you know, employing or sort of putting these clinical scientists through training, and waiting for a firm commitment in terms of roles is very, very challenging. Yeah, I absolutely agree. John.
Yeah, thanks, Clive. I'm just quite optimistic in that respect. I think it's also down to the individual, you know, to pave the way and demonstrate their worth. And I've seen this happen with colleagues around me. So, you know, I think it's about role extension and taking on new responsibilities from others. And if you do that, then the post will be created magically, but they will happen. So I'm just more optimistic.
I think we have to remain optimistic. Okay. But yeah, excellent question. And I guess these are the things that we're going to continue to struggle with. And again, these experiences we're sharing through the Healthcare Science Network. So hopefully together we'll start to support each other through these complex workforce and OD issues. So we've got a question in from Kimberly Lewis. So she's asking, is there going to be a drive to mandate the register? This is another tough question, another really good question. In terms of mandating the register, it does have support, through Welsh Government and the DOTS. I mean, the paper very clearly mandates the support of this role. I guess in terms of being absolutely directive, it can be challenging. We need to work that through. I think one of the things that'll be coming through is for clinical scientists, we hope to see prescribing. These heavily regulated duties, and again, then I think we'll have that strong mandate to enforce this and get these scientists on the register. So my sense is, we've already got a DOTS and Welsh Government mandate through the implementation of this paper as well. So I would say the opportunity and the mandate is there if we choose to take it. So Colin.
It was just to add that in the discussions leading up to the publication of the document and the paper, I have to admit I didn't come across anybody who objected to the idea that should anyone or any employer wish to call a role a consultant clinical scientist role, that person should be on a register. It was not the what, it was the how. That was always the discussion point. So the fact that somebody can demonstrate that they're competent to practice at that level by being on a register, having gone through a process of assessment, is widely accepted. I suppose it's how we implement it, particularly in a very short amount of time. And if I can just say at a personal level, I'm in a very fortunate position that, in a sense, this paper doesn't apply to me because I was appointed as a consultant clinical scientist 25 years ago under Whitley. So I had external assessment by the Department of Health and all that sort of thing, as did my job. So I wouldn't need to go through the process again, but I did. I chose to. I thought, well, I can't ask others to do it. And I suppose I was fortunate to get through it relatively straightforwardly, but it's not as onerous as people may be concerned. I suppose it's making sure that we give all the support and create as much time available for people to do it as possible.
Thanks, Colin. I'm going to call Paul Lee in.
Yeah, cheers, Clive. Thanks very much. It was mainly looking at the imposition or the mandating of anything. So I'm representing the medical engineering, clinical engineering profession, and we very much are coming to the table very late in terms of scientists and registration, for instance. So my worry is that if we're looking to mandate this level, consultant level, we really don't have a handle within our profession on the clinical scientist role, because most of our profession comes from the clinical technologist fraternity. So it's making sure that before we mandate at the top, because you will put a glass ceiling there, that we have support further down the chain, for want of a better word, to support our colleagues. And I noticed somebody's commented on from the physiology side of things about non-mandated registers, albeit they PSA approved. So it's making sure that before we basically chop it off at the top, that we support everybody coming up through the ranks as well, because clinical scientists with our profession are rare. They are vast majority of clinical technologists. So it's supporting them on the way up as well.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That's a very important point. I think we've acknowledged as well, in some of the pathology disciplines, for cellular pathology, for example, we've got consultant healthcare scientists. These are not clinical scientists. So there is some variation there that we're trying to work with. It is a complex area. And what we've been very keen to do through its implementation is not to disadvantage any particular healthcare science group. So there are opportunities we discussed earlier with equivalents. We understand, this takes time. And me, I'm going to be slightly controversial here. I'm still very much in terms of opportunities for career progression. Sometimes it's about the right person for the job and the role, and we need to work with that. But what we've said with this paper and this route, it's standardized, and I think that's one of the key things. As the first nation to set up the standard approach, we want to work with this as much as we can, and then look where there are sort of necessary opportunities for variation. But yeah, Paul, and that's a really good point, and that's one of the sort of the areas that is quite contentious, and we have been considering at length. So, Colin.
Thanks, Clive. Forgive me for doing this, Paul, but I'm going to turn it around and ask you a question, if that's okay.
Go on then.
Yeah. What did you make of the presentation by Tony Milner at the All Wales Medical Physics and Clinical Engineering meeting yesterday about the route to becoming a consultant technologist?
It's the first I heard of it. I understand it's a very, very early proposal that's been sent to IPEM. I have not seen any content of it, but so I can't really comment on it. But this paper has been adopted. It's a Welsh national document. DOTs are on board with it. As you know, I mean, I've come very late in the day. 36 years in the NHS. Only last year, Sarah sent an email out about equivalence to become a clinical scientist. I spent 6 months putting my portfolio together. That's been submitted. I had my clinical scientist interview this week on Tuesday, so I'm waiting for the outcome of that. And with a bit of luck, I could become a clinical scientist. That's the first step towards becoming a consultant clinical scientist, of course, albeit I've left it very late. So if a similar process was there for consultant clinical technologists and it had parity, then I'm all for that. But I've not seen anything in terms of this very, very early proposal.
And I think we'll be watching that space with real interest, Paul. And like I say, we've got consultant healthcare scientists in pathology who are not in that route. We're looking at ways of bringing them together, but at the moment, there is this variation. John.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, just on that point, I think it's important we say that this is not a hurdle in isolation, is it? Because it's linked to equivalency for clinical scientists as well. And just to illustrate that, I know a colleague of mine was registered as a clinical physiologist on the voluntary register, and he secured registration as a clinical scientist. And within 18 months, he was then on the register for the higher register as well as a consultant clinical scientist. So, this is proven, the route's there for people to make that progression, shall we say. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I think we'll move on to the next question now. And this is around standards. It sort of links into John's first response, but consultant clinical scientists, how do you support your services to develop and maintain their high standards? So what's the role there? So it's around the maintenance. How do you set the direction? What is it with the consultant clinical scientist role that gives you that ability to maintain high standards within clinical services? Colin.
I think this is fundamentally a leadership question, Clive, and you could argue it doesn't have to rest with a consultant clinical scientist, and in fact it doesn't. There are leaders everywhere throughout healthcare or health and social care. But one of the key roles of a consultant clinical scientist is the development and delivery of a strategic vision. And so it isn't just taking something that exists and making it happen. That's very much part of it. But it's also actually creating that vision or helping to create that vision in the first place. So it really is about pushing back the boundaries to break new ground and to invite others to come and settle on that ground. So it's, is that something you can teach people? I think you can certainly enable them and support them and help to develop them to the point where their talent is released to an extent that they become very, very good at doing it. I certainly believe that. So the role of a consultant clinical scientist it includes that. And in fact, some might say it's probably the most important role.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, couldn't agree more. John, you'd like to come in on this as well?
Yeah, just briefly, I totally agree with Colin, really. I think I can see the real benefits of doing this in a collaborative way. So it's not about one person's contribution, and It's about leadership is around getting others to rally around the cause as well. And that's what we've seen happen in audiology around quality standard development. So there's a great ownership of the standards, and it's about setting up the environments so it's conducive to that collaborative approach, which means people standing up at a national level and leading the way. So if you've got a bit between your teeth, you've got ambition about something, I think the consultant clinical scientist role gives you authority, a platform to step up there and pave the way.
Thanks, John. Day and John Geen, do you want to come back in?
Thanks, Clive. Yeah. If the question was about clinical standards, yeah, we've got a central role to play because obviously we've been trained to a level where we're considered experts in our field. And I know that over the last 15, 20 years, one of my key roles and one of the most enjoyable parts of my role is working with clinical colleagues in other specialties when they come to us, and they want our advice in terms, particularly in patient care pathways, whether the things I've been involved in recently, acute kidney injury, you sit on national groups establishing fecal immunotesting for colorectal cancer. You sit on national groups, and there's lots of other groups I can name as well. But the role of the consultant clinical scientist is definitely being recognised far more by so many different clinical specialties. An example perhaps might be during the COVID. I was inundated with requests. How do we set up point of care testing services? How do we test COVID at the A&E department, but how do we do it safely? So they'll come to the consultant clinical scientist who has clinical responsibility for the point of care testing services. So in terms of clinical standards, we are definitely central to maintaining very high standards, but it is in partnership, as John and Colin have said, with our clinical colleagues in other specialties.
Yeah, thanks, John. Oh, John, your hand back up again.
You tempted me back in again. I was just thinking about the leadership issue which Colin raised, and I think you can have leadership to deliver things operationally, more of the same. But this is about leadership, about innovation and taking things forward. So it's different. It requires a different sort of skill set, and I think clinical scientists should be particularly skilled in doing that. We've got the toolkit to do that. If you marry that up with ambition in an individual, then you can really move things forward. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Adam, you'd like to come in?
Yeah, just going to mention a few things that have been happening recently. As we know, there's a lot of work going on in Wales to make sure all our data is, interconnected, accessible, and usable. Currently, we mainly collect, I'll call it business records. So who are the patients? Where are they? What are they doing? But the aspiration in the future is to also collect clinical data as well, which is, where bioinformatics really comes into it. It's happening in silos across Wales at the moment, but when all this information becomes more accessible, people wanted to do stuff with it. There's regulations around these, and we want to make sure people are doing it safely. They're doing it to a very high quality. So how have we been doing this in bioinformatics? Well, really, what we're doing at the moment is shouting very loud and trying to get involved in as many things as we can, because we don't get asked, as most people don't know about us. So they're not going to come to us for advice if we don't know that we can provide them the advice. So there's a lot of work been going on across bioinformatics in Wales, engaging with our partners in digital and intelligence and our analyst communities as well, to raise awareness of some of the things that they might not be aware of, such as the medical device regulations, which are, probably in the front of people's mind in areas like clinical engineering and, quality, for example, but not so in our digital departments. But now we're finding that they are coming to us for advice. So, what are we doing? We're shouting and trying to get involved in those conversations at the highest level, so that people do recognize our expertise and we do start to add that value. Because, the worst thing for us, I guess, and for everybody else out there, is to not use your skills that you've trained very hard to acquire, and then you eventually lose them over time.
Yeah, good point, and thanks for that, Adam. We're going to close out. So I think I'll just ask one more question. So in terms of consultant clinical scientists, how long have you had them in your services, and what changes have you seen? So how have they made things better? And I'm going to keep the answer pithy. So if somebody wants to have a go at this.
I'm laughing.
Paul.
Sorry. 1 year.
Yeah. 1 year. Okay. So you're still waiting for the.
And he's gone.
Oh well, that's not the impact I was looking for. But thank you for raising that. I'll go to Adam.
So first of all, we're not aware of any consultant clinical scientists in bioinformatics, but the most senior bioinformaticians in Wales were pretty well in the key conversations around the COVID pandemic. So, leading the bioinformatics and genomic services during those pandemics and being involved with conversations in, Public Health Wales, Welsh Government, UK health authorities, to ensure that they, they're all joined up conversations. We know the capabilities of our services, and we could deliver the services that were required actually during that pandemic, because we wouldn't have been able to do it without them actually.
Good answer, thank you. Go on, Colin. Persuade me with a 1 minute roundup of the impact.
In rehabilitation engineering, we've had a consultant clinical scientist in Wales for over 30 years. Wow. I wasn't the first. There are numbers before me, and actually there are consultant clinical scientists across a lot of clinical engineering more broadly, and medical physics and other areas. So it has been around for a long time. Whether or not those consultants have made an impact over the years, I would say yes, but I'm sure everybody will have their own judgment.
Thanks, Colin. Well, I'm 38 years in NHS experience, and all the consultant clinical scientists I work with have had a profound impact on service. And I'm lucky enough to work have worked in disciplines where it's a fairly mature role. So, okay, I think that is a very positive note to end on. I want to thank everybody. It's been a really rich discussion. I think we should have more of these. I think it's been really good, and the questions have been very challenging actually, and there's lots of food for thought, certainly in terms of the implementation.
So thank you to everybody for coming. We do have certain sessions that we already have in diary, so please do drop onto those. There's information on there, and they'll come out to you via the Healthcare Science Network bulletin as well. So yeah, have a fantastic weekend, and thank you all for your brilliant questions today.